I want to welcome you here. I want to welcome you to the EQ Lab. I want to welcome you to this specific live that I do every single Thursday called the EQ Skills Clinic. If this is your first time here, I would love to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Shyamala, podcast host, media expert for national TV, and founder of the EQ Code, where we help high-performing women transform their relationships so that they can execute on their mission at a whole new level. I am so glad that you are here with me. So as I was mentioning when I was muted, I was mentioning that I am using a new platform, so you will need to bear with me. I am one of the least tech-savvy people on Facebook ever, but I am committed to learning all the bells and whistles to make this experience really awesome for this community. And what you will notice is with this new platform that I'm using for broadcasting, you will need to give, I believe it's giving permission to actually insert your comments or to post your comments. So you'll just need to give permission. And once you do that, my understanding is that you will just be able to, every single time I go live and we are doing one of these EQ skills clinics, you can go ahead and comment. So let's jump into our content for today. And if you are joining live or you're joining the replay, please just drop your comments into the comment box. I will always circle back and come back to them. I'm going to jump into the content right now, and then I will always come back and look at what the comments are here. And I love answering your questions, so please don't hesitate to submit those. So if you've been hanging out with us for a while, you know that there are 4 areas that I like to talk about. I like to talk about mindset skills. I like to talk about communication skills. I like to talk about relationship management skills and leadership skills. In today's EQ Skills Clinic, we are going to be focusing specifically on relationship skills or relationship management skills, as I like to think about them. And the topic I want to talk about with you today is how to overcome guilt when setting boundaries. And the reason I wanted to talk about this particular topic is because boundary setting is one of the core emotional intelligence skills that I work on with women. I believe that boundaries are incredibly, incredibly important, not just for ourselves, but they're also really important in terms of creating safety in relationships. And so for me, boundary setting is important when it comes to personal relationships, when it comes to professional relationships. It really doesn't matter. But the idea of having a lot of clarity around what a relationship is going to look like, the idea of having some defined guidelines around how to navigate and negotiate relationships really does go a long way in creating that emotional safety, which is necessary in order for us to build greater intimacy in our relationships. And again, you'll often hear me talking about the parallels between our personal relationships and our professional relationships, because the beauty of learning emotional intelligence skills is that they are transferable. And not only are they transferable, but I believe that we should be transferring them. And so what I mean by that is that I deeply believe that we are the most calm and confident and resilient when we are able to be congruent in terms of how we show up, both in our personal lives as well as in our professional lives, right? So one of the things that really does build a sense of calm, confidence, and resilience, particularly for women, I notice, is when there is a consistency and a congruency in terms of how I behave personally and how I behave and how I show up professionally, so that I don't feel like I am showing up as one person at home and a whole other person at work. How I navigate my relationships, how I interact with people, how I engage in all of those areas, there's a consistency there. And even if you're not there right now in this moment, I want to really encourage you to think about closing the gap on your your private persona and your public persona, closing the gap on your private persona and your public persona so that you are showing up as consistently, as congruently as possible. It really goes a long way in terms of building confidence. And one of the skills that allows us to do that effectively is boundary setting, right? Boundary setting is a critical skill when it comes to relationship management. And the beauty of boundary setting is that it's also a skill that very easily should transfer into leadership management or our leadership skills, right? Whatever our area of leadership is, okay? And today we're going to talk specifically about boundaries and guilt. Boundaries and guilt. And the reason I wanted to talk about these two concepts together today is because they're kind of like two peas in a pod, right? Boundaries and guilt, you can think of them as two peas in a pod. They are inseparable, really. I have yet to meet a person who has set boundaries, especially when they're starting to learn the skill of boundary setting, without feeling guilty. So at least in the beginning, when we are learning this particular skill around emotional intelligence, we should expect that guilt is going to be part and parcel of that experience, right? So that's the first thing I really want you to conceptualize and think about. I had a coaching call with some private clients on Tuesday, and we were talking about this very concept that when we start saying no, when we start practicing letting other people down in order to prioritize our own self-care, when we begin to wrap our heads around the concept that it's actually okay to disappoint other people, even those people that we love very, very much, when we start wrapping our head around all of those concepts, what we're really talking about is boundary setting. Something happened there to my tech. Give me a moment. I need to just pop back into my notes. Otherwise, I will ramble on and on. Give me a moment, my friends. There we go. Okay. I just lost my notes there on boundaries. And here we are. Okay. So where was I? This is why I have notes. I have notes so that I don't take up 2 hours of your time talking about this particular topic. Okay. So all of these things that I was just talking about, saying no, disappointing another person, letting another person down, all of these practices that I'm talking about all relate to boundary setting. They all fall within that skill of boundary setting, right? And so when we start boundary setting, we should expect that we are going to feel guilty. And one of the things I say to my private clients is if you wait to begin setting boundaries, if you wait to stop feeling guilty in order to begin setting boundaries, you will never, ever set those boundaries, okay? You will never set those boundaries if you wait until you stop feeling guilty in order to actually set them and practice them and maintain them. So the very first step, I believe, is a mindset shift when it comes to boundary setting. And that mindset shift is really the concept and the idea. And that's why I talk about boundaries and guilt being like two peas in a pod. Imagine that especially when you start setting boundaries, you've got boundaries here in that pea pod, and then you've got guilt, right? They sort of coexist side by side. They're part of the same package. It's like a 2-for-1. If you're going to set boundaries, guess what? You get guilt as well, right? It's just part of the parcel. So the question that I really wanted to answer today is, how do you overcome feelings of guilt when you set boundaries? And my answer to that is you don't. You don't actually overcome feelings of guilt when you start setting boundaries. But what you can do, and what I want to teach you how to do today, is how to actually manage feelings of guilt as you practice setting boundaries. And I say practice because just like any emotional intelligence skill, setting boundaries requires practice. It requires loads and loads and loads of practice. And I say this as someone who truly learned the value of setting boundaries, probably, like, if I were to be really honest, in my 30s, right? Even though I was practicing as a psychotherapist since my 20s. I was in my mid 20s when I started practicing. Most of you will know I no longer practice, but I was practicing since I was in my mid 20s. And even though boundary setting is something that we learn clinically, it's in all the textbooks. It's such a part and parcel of being a therapist. For me, I don't think I really learned to do this personally probably until I was really in my mid 30s. It was almost like a whole decade into my career before I really sort of came face to face with the idea that I needed to set boundaries in my own life in order to avoid burnout and in order to be able to show up more fully for the people that really matter to me and for my mission. Okay. So that's the first concept I want you to sort of grab a hold of. Okay. If you're going to set boundaries, if you're going to begin this practice of boundary setting, renegotiating your relationships, I also want you to get comfortable with the discomfort of feeling guilt that is associated with that. Okay, so the idea here is that you set the boundaries, you begin practicing setting boundaries despite feeling selfish or despite feeling mean or bitchy or whatever other toxic thinking you've been telling yourself, right? So the primary reason that women fail to set boundaries is because we are afraid of how others will perceive us. I'm going to say that again because it's really, really important to understand this. The primary reason that women fail to set boundaries in their life, and listen, boundary setting is an act of self-care. It's the ultimate act of self-care. But the primary reason we fail to set boundaries is because we are afraid of what others will think of us, how others will feel. We might be afraid of what others will choose to do when we set boundaries. We might be afraid of pushing people away. We might be afraid of rejection, of abandonment. Some of those core fears can really crop up for us when we begin to set boundaries. And the truth is that traditionally, women have not been raised to believe that it is okay and healthy and normative for us to own our space and for us to even have boundaries in our life, right? Most of us still have been raised to believe that my job is to make other people happy, to people please, to accommodate, to meet the needs of everybody around me. So there's a lot of beliefs that we really need to come up against if we are going to do the work of boundary setting. Okay. So what I want to share with you today from a very practical and strategic skills perspective is I want to give you 3 particular mindset shifts that you need to make in order to set boundaries and to not allow guilt to dictate how you navigate your relationships. So the real question is not the question that we started with today, right? The question that we started with was, how do you overcome guilt when you're setting boundaries? I want us to shift our perspective. And really the question we want to be asking ourselves is, what mindset shifts do I need to make in order to set boundaries and not allow guilt to dictate how I navigate my relationship? So it's all about setting boundaries, feeling the guilt, and not allowing the guilt to determine how you then negotiate your relationships. You don't want guilt to be the driver of your decisions when it comes to your relationships. So I'm going to give you 3 tips. The first tip is to feel the guilt and do it anyway. Feel the guilt and do it anyway. I want you to know and understand that feeling guilt, that emotional experience of guilt, is not a good indication that you are making a mistake. It's not a good indication that you don't deserve to have that boundary. It's not a good indication that there is something wrong with you wanting to negotiate a relationship in a particular way. Okay? The idea that somehow if I feel guilty, I am making a mistake or doing something wrong is actually a toxic thought. It's actually a problematic cognitive distortion. It's a patterned way of thinking that we have learned through time, through experience, through so many like layers of socialization, and sometimes culture can really play a part in that as well. I work with many women that tell me culturally it's never been okay for a woman to set a boundary, to say no, to not drop their everything in the drop of a hat and just go and attend to everybody else's needs. So the first piece really is to understand that if you're going to do this work, if you're going to show up fully for the people that matter most, if you are going to execute fully on your mission, if you're going to show up for yourself, and you're going to set boundaries, which I think you need to do if you're really going to show up fully, then please expect to feel the guilt and do it anyway, right? And do not allow yourself to believe that if I feel guilty, it means I'm doing something wrong. In the context of boundary setting, guilt is never a good indication that you're making a mistake or that you're doing something wrong, because we have years and years and years of conditioning that tell us not to set boundaries. Okay, so in this instance, setting boundaries, guilt is a terrible indicator that you're making a mistake or doing something wrong. The second strategy, the second skill I want to give you is to start with one relationship at a time. What do I mean by that? So often when I work with women and we begin to make some of these mindset shifts around what boundaries really are, we begin to understand the correlation between boundaries and feelings of guilt. We begin to understand and really come face to face with the idea that if I continue to live and lead a boundary-less life, I'm going to head towards burnout. It's going to absolutely decrease my capacity for contribution. It also will not allow me to, if you're a parent, it will not allow me to model healthy relational functioning for my children. When women become exposed to these new ways of thinking, one of the things that can happen sometimes is we want to begin setting boundaries everywhere. And I remember this for myself. I remember when I first really started to embrace the beauty of boundaries, if I could call it that, when I began to really understand how important and how valuable and how loving and how kind and how respectful it was to have boundaries in a relationship. I became this passionate boundary lover, right? Like I just wanted boundaries everywhere. I wanted to set them left, right, and center in every single relationship. And I came to understand that relationships could actually flourish when there was a context of boundaries within those relationships. And one of the things I would say to you is, if you're beginning to feel excited about the idea of setting boundaries, I'm really excited for you if you're feeling that way, but I want you to start with one relationship at a time. It's really, really important when we're beginning to make changes to our relationships that we go slow. Okay. And I'll tell you why. Relationships are so core to who we are. They have a huge impact on our mental health, a tremendous impact on our mental health. And so if we begin to navigate and negotiate our relationships differently, we are breaking patterns. It's like a pattern interrupt in our life. And when we do that, I do think it's important, particularly when we're talking about something as intimate as our relationships, it's important to start with one relationship at a time. So if you try and set boundaries everywhere and with everyone, the way that I did when I first came across, the beauty of boundaries, you'll become overwhelmed. It'll be really difficult to maintain those boundaries. It'll be really difficult to process and manage all of the emotions that come from boundary setting, and you'll find yourself feeling really overwhelmed. So my tip here is to start small. So start with small boundaries and focus on the most critical part of boundary setting, and that'll be in the next tip that I give you. I'll tell you what the most critical part of boundary setting is, but I would say, start really, really small. Start with a relationship where you think it might might be somewhat easier for you to set the boundary. That's one thing I would say. And start with a small boundary. It could be something as simple as, my family knows this now about me, I go to bed really early. I'm a fairly early riser. My husband does shift work, so my sleep is very, very precious to me. And so I go to bed early just to make sure that I'm feeling good for the next day. And so typically I don't take phone calls really after 8 or 9 p.m. I'm already starting to wind down. I'm already starting to kind of get myself ready for the next day. My daughter's bedtime is 8 p.m. So, I'm the one that tucks her in, and we have our little nighttime chat at that time. And then I'm starting to get ready for bed myself. So that's an example of a small boundary that you can begin to set that would really be an act of self-care for yourself, and is probably an easier type of boundary to set. So it could be something as simple as, your habits around communication or use of your phone, or people phoning you or accessing you at a certain time of the day. Okay, so start small, start with the easiest relationships. Don't start with like the relationship that causes you the most stress, or that person you're most afraid to set boundaries with, like your mother or your mother-in-law or your partner or whatever it is. Start really, really small, okay? And my final tip for you is actually the most critical tip for boundary setting. And the truth is, I should really do a whole other session on this particular piece of boundary setting. And that is to maintain the boundaries you've set. Maintain the boundaries that you have set. So what I know from all of my years of working with people is that when I teach a woman to set boundaries, I realize and recognize that that is one skill, one very, very important skill. And once we begin working on setting boundaries, I know it is time to really roll up our sleeves and do the deeper and harder work of maintaining boundaries. Okay, there's a difference. And I want you to recognize that just because you have set a boundary doesn't mean that that boundary is, it's not like a fence, right? Think of a boundary like a fence. Like, if you put up a fence, a fence will indicate what stays on that side of the fence and what stays on this side of the fence. There's a physical barrier. Well, boundaries, on the other hand, require a ton of maintenance. Why? Because typically we are setting boundaries with people, and people that are close to us, and people that have regular access to us. So when we are setting a boundary, we also need to be thinking ahead to, how am I going to maintain that boundary? And what I've often found is, when we set a new boundary in an old relationship, right? So a new boundary in an existing relationship, a relationship that has a history, a relationship that might be filled with some, really awesome patterns and some unhealthy patterns. When we set a new boundary in an old relationship, that work of maintaining that boundary becomes that much more important. It becomes absolutely critical. And in fact, you should predict that working to maintain that boundary is going to require extra support, extra strategies, extra skills, nuanced ways of communicating around that boundary in order to maintain it. So maintaining the boundaries that you have set is my third tip. And this is really usually where things kind of unravel for most women, right? Usually where I really see women struggling, and the women that I work with, is setting the boundary is one thing, and then I'll, chat with them the next week, and they're like, Shyamala, I don't know how to what do I do? They just pushed back, or they got upset with me, or they did the thing anyway that I asked them not to do. What do I do now, right? So maintaining that boundary is really, really important. And truth be told, when we fail to maintain the boundaries that we've already set, we actually do even more damage to the relationship, because what ends up happening is we are basically teaching and training this person that if I set a boundary, you know what, you don't even have to take it seriously, because I will just take that boundary down the very next week. All you have to do is just sort of push a little bit, and that boundary's gone. right? So if you have been spinning your relationship wheels, so to speak, I want you to reach out. I want you to let me know how this resonates for you. I want you to let me know if you have any questions. I am popping back over here to the live stream. I am seeing your comments here. So important. Consistency means we don't feel like an imposter anywhere in our lives. Yes, absolutely. This is so helpful. Guilt is still there for me, even as I continue to hold my boundaries. It really is the socialization of trying to keep everyone happy and liking me. I need to challenge my guilt every time I hold a boundary at work, at home, and with my family of origin. Yes, maintenance is so challenging. Yeah, this is the key, right? And this is what is really, really difficult and really challenging for us. But I think when we have some anticipatory guidance, is what I call it, some anticipatory guidance around the fact that we will feel guilty, that people will, just because we set a boundary doesn't mean people are going to respect it, doesn't mean people are not going to challenge it, doesn't mean that that relationship is now like fixed. Not at all. And it might not be a very popular view, but the truth is setting that boundary truly is just that first step. It is that first step, that first stage in renegotiating relationships. It's that first step, that first stage in boundary and relationship renegotiation. Maintaining it then requires that strategic kind of support, really implementing those skills, sticking with it, finding assertive ways. This is where we bring in assertive communication to really maintain that boundary. Again, if you're watching the replay, drop your comments, drop your questions. I would love to hear where you're having success with boundary setting and where you are struggling with boundary setting as well. I want to remind all of you, if you're not aware, that we have opened registration to the Courageous Intimacy Bootcamp. Speaking of boundaries, speaking of relationship skills, we have opened registration for the Courageous Intimacy Bootcamp. This is a 5-day completely free. It is a live training and coaching event. I will be live with you every single day for the duration of that bootcamp, and I will be training you, I will be teaching you, and I will be coaching you live on how to implement, all the strategies that we talk about inside of the EQ Lab. So the event starts April 12th. It goes right until April 16th. Registration is open. We already have several members that have registered and have taken action. So if you have not yet registered, I want you to make sure that you do that. I'm going to tell you real quick what we are covering over the 5 days. So on day one, or session one, we are going to look at why personal relationships impact professional success. I want you to understand in this session that our capacity for success is in fact tied to our ability to navigate our relationships. Next, in day two, we're going to look at how to keep our cool in every single conversation. We're going to look at this mindset secret that really does allow us to navigate our conversations with calm and confidence. Day three is all about how to ask for what we need without feeling afraid. And this, for me, is one of the most critical skills that I could teach any woman that I work with, because the truth is most women that I meet tell me that they find it really hard to ask for what they need. And day four, we're going to look at how to build intimacy so that you can better fuel your mission. The reason this is so important is because when our relationships are thriving, we tend to have greater impact in terms of our career, our mission, and our professional success. And finally, on day five, we're going to wrap it all together, and we are going to look at how to implement high performance relationships for next level success. We're going to look at how to tie all of this together so that we can really vision cast together what this can look like and the impact that this can have long-term for us. If you joined us for the lot, thank you so much, Maria. So Maria is one of my team members. She has dropped the link for you. She is also going to be supporting us this time we do this live event. If you joined us in February, I think it was, February, we did another boot camp. I sort of did it solo, and we had so many comments and so much feedback and questions and things like that that I've brought Maria on to support us through this particular boot camp. She is going to be your point person. She's going to be your go-to girl. If you have any questions at all, she's going to get you your workbook. She's going to get you all set up. If you need help getting caught up on the teaching and the content, she is here to support you. So please do make use of her. She's an amazing resource. She is deeply passionate as well about helping women live their best lives. So I'm very, very grateful for her support. All right, my friends, thank you so much for joining me. Again, any questions, comments, drop them in and I will circle back, and I will definitely see you next week. I should say, we are changing the time of our Facebook Lives. The EQ Skills Clinic is still going to be on Thursdays. It'll be an hour earlier. So we are going to do this at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time starting next week, which I believe is might be April 1st or beginning of April. Anyway, we're into April. I can't believe it, but we are moving the time to 10 a.m. on Thursdays. So I will see you there. Bye, guys. Have a great day.